on the leadership training. I've done a few of these. Over the last couple of years, I've run these programs myself for boards, and I've also run these for management teams. What I focused on was, let's start with kind of business value. Why is this important? And obviously, Unilever is very forward leaning. So you maybe start with a lot of that assumed as a given. And you don't go on like, well, climate change is real, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You kind of assume a lot of stuff is just given and you start, midway. But then you kind of go into, okay, great. How do we actually start quantifying business value from this? Do we look at like consumer appetite to pay more? Do we look at brand durability? Do we look at something else? You then kind of say, okay, how does this play out differently for different companies trying to capture that value? I always take a value chain example. I say, you could have companies at different parts of the same value chain, and they're prioritizing different things within the ESG basket. For some, it's like carbon and water and single-use materials. For some, it's like carbon and labor practice and local communities. For some, it might be something different. And I kind of try and give it an idea of how you want to focus on winning the game in some places and playing the game in other places, or just staying above board in other places, and deciding that mix is part of what I'm trying to upskill the team on. Is like that you don't try to be amazing at everything. You try to be amazing at a few things and good at many things. And then I kind of try and go to, how do you make those decisions or trade-offs? And then I go to like, what are the areas that you should think about prioritizing within the business? Now, this is like a relatively short primer. It's like a couple of hours. It's a big investment, actually.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of The State of Sustainability, brought to you by Altruistic. In this episode, we're going to run through sustainability-linked bonds, so when, where, and how they can be used effectively, and also how to set up a sustainability training program. Hi, Saif, how are you doing?
I'm good, thanks. I am actually, I'm still recovering from this red-eye flight that I had, where I discovered what the actual worst seat that you can have on the plane is, which turns out to be the middle seat of the back row of the central column, basically. So you have the maximum distance from windows, aisles, and also the minimal reclining room as well. So I find that is actually the undisputed worst seat you can have on a flight. And I had that for a glorious, whatever it is, 8 hours from Chicago to London. So I am still recuperating. It's probably going to take me the better part of June to get over that. But I'm glad to be here, Izzy. So thank you for asking.
Seth, maybe it's calmer. Maybe next time you should do a Greta Thunberg and sail the Atlantic to get back. Your journey might be a bit more pleasant.
I'm actually not kidding. Before boarding the plane, I was actually thinking this would be so much easier if I could just go by ship. You could just, it would just be such a much nicer experience. If you could get Wi-Fi, maybe you can. I don't know. I haven't been on a ship. I haven't been on a long haul ship ever. So maybe you can get Wi-Fi on these things now, in which case it would actually be fine. Traveling through Europe by train, I find is actually just super nice compared to flights. I personally hate flights, but no, I would totally be up for that multi-day journey if possible.
I was actually looking at going to Ireland for a Coldplay concert at the end of August. I was like, okay, how do I get there? Ireland's so close, like, it's our closest island, maybe compared to France, I don't know. But I was looking at, and you had to get a couple of trains, a ferry, then a train on the other side. And it costs, and the equivalent flight from London to Dublin costs about £48, and the train and ferry fare cost £352. And I was like, this is mad. Like, obviously I want to do the right thing.
It's actually quite fun, because if you look at how carbon taxation works in the UK, I think when I did this analysis at some point a few years ago, the spread was something like minus £25 to 130, 140 pounds or something. And the reason for that spread is that certain sectors are actually incentivized to burn carbon, basically. And air travel is one of them. So if you just look at the ridiculously low costs that you have on some of these flights, there's a massive carbon element to it as well. And I think that at the same time, there's probably a lot of low-hanging fruit in trying to adjust national carbon budgets by using taxation as a lever. So yeah, I hear you. It's insane. Ilya and our team was actually also finding this. I think that just the difference in flight versus train costs is astronomical sometimes.
Well, before we get really angry and start talking about the government incentives for the aviation industry, let's move on
Or
to
elections, or God forbid, elections. This is not the year to
don't
talk
get
about
onto the
elections.
election. We've also
Anyone's
got a
elections.
US-based audience, so we're not going to go into the
We're not
UK
going to go there.
political
We're not going to
dynamics.
go into no politics here. This is a politics-free
Nope.
zone.
It's a safe zone. Right. Okay. So Lego announced last week that from 2024, a percentage of Lego's group bonuses will be tied to sustainability measures. So overarching KPI for this is a carbon intensity metric achieved by comparing scope 1 and 2 emissions and one category of scope 3 emissions, which is business travel. And this is with how many bricks have been manufactured, Lego bricks have been manufactured over the same period. And this is like company wide. It's not just management or execs, which I think is really cool. But I wanted to just also, before we get into it, read out a couple of learnings that the VP and head of sustainability of Lego had from this experience of setting this bonus. So, and I think these are really interesting and also, they resonate a lot with me. So number one, a carbon KPI or bonus is a relatively straightforward concept, but when salaries are involved, it takes time to get it right in terms of auditing, accuracy, and overall scope. Number two, relative emissions reductions are not necessarily easy or wrong, nor absolute reductions are hard or right. It depends on the target and the ambition behind them. Number three, it's better to start with scope 1 and 2 with a little bit of 3 and add more later on, then endlessly wait for a full scope data set to emerge. Number four, be prepared for the level of engagement and energy from your organization as soon as they realize that part of their salary is now related to carbon performance. Make sure you have plans and ideas for all your teams that will inevitably reach out and want to take action. Number five, bring your finance team and auditors along on the journey from day one and embed the project with your CFO as soon as possible. Number six, have a shadow year to work out the kinks and be prepared for it to be bumpy. And number seven, take whatever percentage in the bonus structure you can get. It's a start, not the end game. I think those are really great learnings. And Saif, I would love to just call on you to see if you've got any observations off the back of them.
Yeah, I mean, I agree, Izzy. I think lots of really good learnings. I think a really great way to approach it. I more or less agree with all the principles that you just listed out, Izzy. I think some to particularly note. Great to have finance involved early and kind of get buy-in. I think great to have a shadow year as well to work out the kinks. These are great innovations. I think it's also very clever to focus on scope 1 and 2 and then business travel and kind of commuting because of two things. One is that these are areas that it is easy for you to get great business data on and also for you to kind of control as well by virtue of the same process. Like these are things that are within your operational control. You can manage these levers quite actively versus something happening far upstream or far downstream in the business. And then also the chemical conversion rate is much less open to dispute because these are things like, fuel to carbon conversion rates or energy use to carbon conversion rates. And so there's a lot less variability here versus something like agriculture or packaging or other components where there's a lot more variability. So I think it's a very cleverly set up program. In general, I am a big fan of linking bonuses and compensation programs to sustainability performance or metrics. I do have one question though, or one I guess one thing that seems a bit strange to me, and I'm saying this less as a sustainability professional and more thinking as a business operator, which is, if you think about company-wide bonuses, I mean, let's take our company for instance, we could easily say, look, like the most important thing to us, for example, is, let's say it's revenue, or let's say it's actually impacted our customers or whatever. Let's link bonuses across the company to this one metric. And I kind of feel like we've decided not to do that kind of thing multiple times because we recognize that actually every individual might have a highly different level of ability to control that outcome. And so in a way, it's kind of, I don't want to say arbitrary, but sort of abstracted. Like, if an individual in Lego has very limited ability to actively control this, and so does it actually function as an incentive to change behavior? I think that that is much less true at the level of senior leadership. Because at the level of senior leadership, you have the ability to kind of drive cross functional collaboration. Certain parts of the leadership team have a really high ability to control sustainability KPIs. Certain parts maybe a bit less, but like everyone in the leadership team, I would argue, has some reasonable ability to drive action on this. Whereas the further you get into the company structure and to like, lower tiers of the organization, I think that gets a lot harder. And so I just kind of wonder to what extent you can actually drive outcomes through a company-wide incentive scheme. But actually, I'd love your thoughts on that as well, Izzy, because I could lean either way. That's the question I have, basically, or something I'm uncertain about.
I agree. And I think this is actually going to lead on to our next topic quite well. I was actually speaking with Christina O'Keefe from Kerry Group the other day. And up until this point, and actually for context, I've only really seen sustainability linked bonuses happen in the context of like the leadership team and executive team. So it's really interesting that Lego are trying to roll it out across the whole company. And I would like to follow this to see how effective it is. Maybe we should even get Tim on the podcast to discuss it in further. But Christina O'Keefe, they don't have any sustainability linked bonuses, but they do have an awesome internal education program, which has different kind of incentives. So it linked to like engagement or learning metrics around the course. So they would have incentives like even things like stickers. They've got stickers that people, once they've completed the course, they can add to their computer, and that becomes almost like a badge of honor. Similarly, in Perfetti Group, which makes the candy company, they have engagement rates linked to being able to partake in the Cambridge Sustainability Business Management course. So I think there are lots of different like softer ways of being able to engage the company as a whole, not just bonuses. But yeah, I'd be interested to see how this rollout works.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that there are also different ways you should engage different teams in the company. And so I think that the idea of saying, look, let's get everyone excited about switching the lights off before they leave the office. Like, I think we're past the stage where that is a relevant lever or considered to be a relevant lever, certainly in Europe, because in any case, switching the actual energy tariff or the energy supply to renewables is much more impactful than getting people to do energy efficiency in the office, and it's not something that you could do as an individual. So I think there is just like a journey away from that kind of thing where it's just a company wide kumbaya, let's kind of all save the energy sort of situation, and more towards actually what can each team do differently in its own territory in a nuanced way to drive significant impact. So, again, I'm a big fan of like sustainability linked performance in general. I'm just kind of, a little intrigued to see how it can play out. And I think there's a lot of room for it to play out differently for different teams. Training, I think, is a big area where you can actually start to bring out that differentiation.
Saif, before we move on to the training program setup, for these linked bonuses, what would you say, because I guess they change and they evolve over a certain amount of time. So definitely with scope 1 and 2, you've probably got some easy wins. So making those energy transitions, that would mean that you can meet those performance targets quite easily. But if you're doing this, say, over like a longer period, I can imagine that the bonuses are going to change as time progresses. Do you have any advice for how to like manage for that?
Yeah, I mean, and so again, I guess blending a little, thinking as a sustainability professional and thinking as a business operator, I would be more inclined to kind of think about inputs that teams can control and manage, and let's say outcomes that you're aiming for, and I would almost ignore for the time being outputs. And let me kind of distinguish between those three, right? Like I see an output as like, did the emissions number go down? And that might be something, that changes year on year. And to an extent, it's correlated with the inputs that you can kind of put in. But there's other stuff at play there as you start going beyond scope 1 and 2. There's emissions factor choices, there's quality of data, there's a lot of this sort of stuff. When I look at outcomes, I would say that there are some outcomes that you want to solve for as a business that mean that you will kind of continue to deliver good performance in years to come. So, for instance, are you actually working, let's say, to uh, build better visibility on the supply chain? Are you working to have stronger relationships with key suppliers? Are you working to transition specific materials in your value chain to other materials? Are you looking to build significant capacity for your value chain to both use recycled content and generate recycled content and generate recyclable output as well, for instance? These are like system shifts that I would say are great outcomes to be targeting. And I think that the achieving these outcomes is going to be the result of year after year focus on different inputs. What I mean by those inputs is, you might be saying, okay, look, actually, one of the inputs here is, have I started segmenting out my suppliers and really identifying which suppliers I can build relationship type A with versus type B? Have I really started looking at each individual material type and starting to do the analysis on which materials I can swap to or shift to? Have I started reorienting supplier contracts to be more conducive to a long-term partnership and collaboration? I'm focusing a little on procurement and supply chain levers here, but you get the idea. Like these are sort of inputs, and whether or not these move the emissions numbers, let's say next year by 5% or 2% or 10%, I almost think is less important than in the broader scheme of things, because you're kind of making big strides on a journey towards better outcomes. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So in that sense, would you suggest that the functional leads own, if they do want to do linked performance bonuses, that they own a certain KPI that is relevant to that function? So as you said, like, I don't know, procurement can have the number of supply contracts in there that relate to data sharing or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. So I would kind of say, one of the frameworks that most startups use, for example, is OKRs. You look at objectives and key results. What is an objective that I want to achieve? And then what are some key results through which I can measure my progress towards these objectives, right? Like, you could use that. You could use key performance indicators. There's a whole dogma around what is the right way to do this, and everyone has their own take on OKRs as well. I think it doesn't really matter what framework you're using, but I would say that figuring out what are the actual goals that you want to achieve, and then what is work that your team can own and control and meaningfully drive to deliver out better outcomes. That's the way that I would approach it. So, let's say in our business, for example, one of our North Stars is like, how are we, what is the extent of the emissions in the shopping basket or the grocery basket that we are managing and controlling? Like, if you kind of look at everything that the average consumer buys, our aspiration at Altruistic is we should be able to measure, quantify, but ultimately also manage an increasing share of the emissions of what sits within the consumer's basket. And so there's a part of that that sits with marketing, which is like, how do we get in front of the biggest companies, the biggest brands that have the largest share of basket in the consumer basket? And we could now think about what are the inputs or activities that marketing in our business can control to make sure that we have as many at bats as possible, as many opportunities to work with as many companies as possible. At the same time, if I shift and focus on research within our company, our research teams are responsible for helping build out our environmental factor database, making sure we have as many unique data points, whether it's secondary data or primary data, to quantify emissions and increasingly water and other metrics as well. And driving accuracy, precision, granularity there allows us to get much better outcomes, much better results in the work that we do with the brands that sit in that consumer basket. And so you can kind of see these two as completely different, ending up in the same place, but actually the activities within their controls are different, and makes sense then to incentivize those teams to focus on delivering their work really well rather than hold them to a bar that is a few levels abstracted from them. But that's maybe somewhat of a personal view, just having thought quite extensively about this in the context of our business and also, in previous years as a consultant.
Yeah. And another thing that the head of sustainability at Lego said was that this wouldn't have been able to happen if he didn't have C-suite buy-in and support from leadership team. Do you have any advice for getting the team or the leadership team behind a sustainability linked bonus scheme? Are there any kind of tips of the trade that you've seen that have worked versus not worked?
I think there are. So I think to an extent, I think this is the same for any other sustainability initiative that you want to run past the board or the leadership team, which is ideally you talk as little as possible about sustainability and as much as possible about business value. Because ultimately, especially if you look at like the zeitgeist or the mood, particularly in the US, but also I think in many other parts, many other markets and many other parts of the economy, I think that interventions and initiatives within the business that do not generate shareholder value in the near term, the medium term, or the early long term are unlikely to sort of last very long. And so I think that the age or the moment in time where you could just say, look, this is a great thing to do for the planet and this will pay off in 30 years. I think there was maybe a brief period between 2018, 19 and 2020 where that was working. But now I think you need a much more near-term link to shareholder value. And so I would really focus on the original basis for sustainability in the business. What is the business value that you are going to create? Is there more revenue coming out of doing this well? Like there's been some great coverage on the collaboration between Waitrose and Tony's Chocolate Only, for example, or the Tony Open Chain. And they've actually found that they've managed to increase prices of the product by, they incorporate better practices within the supply chain. They increase the price of the actual consumer product. And so actually there's like a top line benefit here. There are not going to be a lot of situations where you can do that, but that's a great example where you can. And that's business value, right? That's a good story for the board, a good story for leadership. And you can say that, having better labor practices within the cocoa value chain helps us do better business. Therefore, it makes sense for us to have a company-wide target to achieve something correlated to this outcome. And we are going to reward people for their progress towards that target. That's the narrative that I would take. I would start with the business value, and then I would position performance incentives as one part of a toolbox that should include training, tools, incentives, and let's say processes. Like I would think of maybe these as the four big levers of the influence model that you use to drive change. And I would just say to the leadership, this is how we would do it if it was a digital transformation. This is how we would do it if it was a cost transformation. And this is how we're going to do it as a sustainability transformation. But in all of those examples, there is clear business value that needs to be identified for the business to just undergo the massive calorie burn it takes to transform.
Thanks, Saif. That makes total sense. I think speaking of the next lever, the training program, let's have a quick break and then we'll jump into the depths of that. So, setting up a sustainability training program. I think we can all agree that it's great to have a sustainability strategy, but if you don't have the whole company behind it or aligned with it, you're never really going to be able to achieve those punchy goals that you've set. So, Saif, I'm going to pick your brains on how best to set up an internal sustainability strategy and get these colleagues behind you. When you're starting to design it, think about how it's going to look and how you're going to roll it out in your business. Are there any considerations that you should take at this really early stage before doing so?
Yeah, and Izzy, just to get specific, I think let's talk about training programs rather than strategy more generally, because we could well go down a rabbit hole. But it's funny, I was actually just having this conversation with Kim, who leads the sustainability team at Griffith Foods, just very recently. And Griffith is a B2B food business. And so in their context, training and upskilling commercial teams and sales teams is an important aspect of the sustainability training agenda. There are other situations, in fact, probably every company actually, where training the procurement team is an important part of the sustainability agenda. And actually, I can see different trainings for different teams. So maybe, if you kind of think about, to start with, what are the communities that I need to upskill onto sustainability, and to what extent and in what way? And I would probably think about, let's say, three types or three angles to that. One, I would think, is very senior leadership team, and you don't need to have them do like a 6-month course, but maybe it's a 2-day boot camp, for example, with some half-day kind of primers now and then. But I definitely think that there's an opportunity and a need to get CEO, boards, and C-suite in general upskilled onto sustainability to understand what their peers are looking at. And, like, again, when I was at McKinsey, I would do this on sustainability, but I've also seen this done on like advanced analytics and AI and digital. Like any big new transition or trend, you want to make sure that you also educate the board, senior leadership and team, etc., onto a generalist view of the landscape. That's like one community. I think there's a second, which is functionally, you need to have a slightly different training experience focused on slightly different capabilities for different teams within the organization. I would think of procurement as very distinct. Like, how do you manage a buying conversation with a supplier? And how do you actually shift that supplier's thinking and that supplier's trajectory to a very different trajectory where it's enabling your sustainability program? There's a huge opportunity, a huge need for that. Sales, if in a B2B organization, I think, again, huge need for doing that better. Marketing, particularly in B2C organizations, what to say, what not to say, how to position messages, what to be careful of, like huge need and huge upside from doing that well. And so I would kind of think of the second category of just specialist function by function training programs that are more intensive maybe than what you're doing with the leadership, but also very specific and very nuanced. And then the third one is I would think about, I'm by the way, I'm rushing through these because I think previously we've done episodes where I've said three things and then I've gotten one of them or two of them down. But anyway, the third one I would say is company-wide education. And I think there you can again be very kind of long and thin. You can say, look, we're going to do, a half day once a year, or we're going to do like a couple of hours every quarter or something, or something very light touch. Maybe it's part of onboarding, for example, or it's just woven into existing trainings across the company. But something very generalist and very widespread, I would say, is the third type of training that I would look at. By the way, I think there's a big shortage in training providers that can do any of what I've described to any degree of quality, which I think is just another problem, frankly.
I think what you've mentioned here is probably 5, if not 6 whole full-time employees' work, like being able to set up, like align, coordinate the people, do all the logistics behind it, create the content. Like, it is a lot of work. And if you're doing that on top of your scope 3 calculations, engaging suppliers, like how are you supposed to manage this? And do you see this as something that you should do internally and you should set up internally, or should you look elsewhere for, like external like consultants or help to come in and actually set this up for you?
Yeah, so I think the companies that are doing this well and likely to do this well are those that have already invested historically in training and capability building as a big lever. And so, I think, for example, I actually think Kim at Griffiths was telling me this, she's ex-Mars, and I think Mars has like a really well-established corporate training program itself already. And so they kind of push this through the same training program, basically. When I was at McKinsey put a lot of effort into training and capability building all through the journey of the person with McKinsey, which meant that you could actually upskill on sustainability at many different inflection points in your career. It was just like dovetailed in with existing training programs and opportunities. So I think that the companies that are best placed to do this well are just those that already have a culture of training and capability building and upskilling. That doesn't mean that you can't do this well if you don't have that history and capability and muscle, but it is just harder for you, right? Like your organization has not built the infrastructure that you can piggyback on, which means I think you do need to then go external and find other partners and vendors. I would look for what already exists and is well regarded and reputed. You mentioned the Cambridge program, Izzy, which I've heard great things about. I know many alumni from that program. I think Fran at Green Core, Hugh at Gusto, I think also went there. Our own Greg as well, right, from our team. And I think that program is well regarded. Um, I don't see a bunch of others out there doing the same thing with the same industry recognition. But I think it's an opportunity. I'm sure there will be others coming out.
Quite a lot of questions off the back of this, but the first one is like the list you gave me. So the board, functional teams, and then company wide. Is that the order of prioritization that you'll go down?
Pretty much, actually, yeah. I would actually do it that way. I mean, that wasn't what I had intended when I was listing it out, but I would actually do it that way. I would say I would probably start with making sure that leadership is engaged, bought in, and understands context. And I actually don't think most organizations do this well enough or take it seriously enough or start with that. But I would start with that. And then I think from there, everything else flows. And I would maybe have an order of priority within the functions. So I would again lean on business value. That should be the North Star here. So if you've said, look, we're a B2B organization, business value from sustainability for us is getting longer term, more strategic relationships with key customers where we have a bigger share of wallet versus the competition. That is business value. Then you need sales teams to be front and center of the training kind of program that you're setting up. And maybe the first function that you kind of upskill should be that function. Or you say, look, actually, we have a big operational transformation to go through. And at the other end of that, we will not only be more sustainable, but we'll be much more resilient as well to external shocks, supply chain risk, etc. And then maybe it's actually the operations team that you need to go, prioritize. So I would lean on business value and prioritize within that. And then the company-wide thing, I would say, probably can come a bit later. It also has more exposure, arguably a little less upside, I would say.
And where does the sustainability team fit into that? Because I think increasingly we're seeing like sustainability teams hiring people that don't necessarily have the sustainability knowledge, but they've got the like vocational skill set of change management, etc. So would the sustainability team be at the top of that sequence?
It's a good question, Izzy. I think that I kind of implicitly assumed that one might be bringing in a sustainability professional who is bringing expertise into the business. And a lot of companies are doing that. They're like seeing hiring as a way to acquire expertise that they don't already have. Where you don't have that, let's say you're making a lateral shift and you've kind of moved someone from one part of the company to another part of the company where they're now leading sustainability, I would actually see maybe even the leadership training as the opportunity for this person to go through that training experience with other members of the leadership team. And so I think there's like two ways you could approach that. One is to say actually the sustainability team and leaders should get a slight run up versus the leadership team. They should go through the program a little earlier so they can then be the experienced guides taking the rest of the leadership team through the training experience or through the upskilling experience. The other could be actually that they're in it alongside the rest of the leadership team, and it is a shared experience, but the new sustainability leader is going to carry on upskilling beyond where the leadership team kind of, goes back to work on their regular stuff. And this person will actually carry on upskilling beyond that. I think there are different flavors of this that you can experiment with.
Yeah. And I think I want to take us into like what actually the content of these training programs look like. And as I mentioned earlier, I spoke to Isobel Bird and Christina O'Keefe from Curry Group, who have honestly set up the coolest sustainability educational program internally. And they've rolled this out company-wide, so to 12,000 employees and in their wired community. So those who are connected by email, they're now rolling out to their unwired community of employees. the format of their program is that they have 6 modules which all align with their sustainability strategy. So one of the module will be health and nutrition, one will be sustainable sourcing, and it goes on. And with those, they've created 6 videos aligning with them. And maybe it's worth noting that all of this content is like evergreen, so it's supposed to last for at least 3 years before they evolve and change it. And also it's uniform, so it's all the same across the globe, but where they actually change the content is how it is deployed. So when the content is set at a global level, it is then taken to by regional teams, and they create it and they change it, the deployment into different areas. So Christina, who's the regional lead of North America, she did watch parties. So they had these films and these modules filmed at gatherings where people would have pizzas. Then they would have like an open Q&A with set questions. And these questions can be anything from like, what is scope 3 to also like, if you were the like president of the US, what would you prioritize, nutrition or sustainability? Which really got this like kind of conversation rapport going. But then the EU, the lead, they actually did a completely different take, and they got like experts, so like chemical and engineering experts to like lead sessions on specific parts. So I think that was just really cool to see how that you can set content, but also like which is scalable and it's not too overwhelming, but you can actually deploy it in different ways. But to get actually into the setup of the content or like the format and like the actual like meat of the content, Saif, I'd love to ask you like what you think are good like anchors to lean on.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, we could talk about this for quite some time, because I think that it looks different for each, if you look at those 3 categories mentioned, leadership training, function specific training, and company wide, I think that the content can look wildly different across those 3 buckets and even within those. And so maybe if I just take one, just to give you an idea of like how I would approach this. So on the leadership training, I've done a few of these. I've over the last couple of years, I've run these programs myself for boards, and I've also run these for management teams. And so, one that I did last year, I think, was with one of the Unilever management teams for one of their business units, and we had, I think, like 25 or 30 members of the senior most management team attend. And it was like an ESG wide training program. I normally don't like talking about ESG in general. As you know, I normally want to just focus on environmental sustainability because I think it's very distinct from social and governance, but I made a small exception here and I talked about ESG as a whole. And in that context, what I focused on was let's start with kind of business value. Why is this important? And obviously, Unilever is very forward leaning. So you maybe start with a lot of that assumed as a given. And you don't go on like, well, climate change is real, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You kind of assume a lot of stuff is just given and you start, midway. But then you kind of go into, okay, great. How do we actually start quantifying business value from this? Do we look at like consumer appetite to pay more? Do we look at brand durability? Do we look at something else? You then kind of say, okay, how does this play out differently for different companies trying to capture that value? I always take a value chain example. I say, you could have companies at different parts of the same value chain, and they're prioritizing different things within the ESG basket. For some, it's like carbon and water and single-use materials. For some, it's like carbon and labor practice and local communities. For some, it might be something different. And I kind of try and give it an idea of how you want to focus on winning the game in some places and playing the game in other places, or just staying above board in other places, and deciding that mix is part of what I'm trying to upskill the team on. Is like that you don't try to be amazing at everything. You try to be amazing at a few things and good at many things. And then I kind of try and go to how do you make those decisions or trade-offs? And then I go to like, what are the areas that you should think about prioritizing within the business? Now, this is like a relatively short primer. It's like a couple of hours. It's a big investment, actually, because if you think about 20, 30 members of a senior management team, this is significant prime time. Like for this, like I was getting what the board meeting would get and more, actually, like a larger stakeholder base than the board meeting. And, this is just sustainability and it's just me. And so I'm very conscious of that responsibility. And so I'm trying to cover a lot of ground in this, but I'm also trying to give a framework that they can take away and use to actually drive work. And so I try and think about like very dense value creation in a few hours for that sort of session. Whereas if I was running that, let's say with a more junior team, I might take 2 days over the same content. But just to give a bit of a flavor, Izzy.
Yeah, and I think also like I can imagine that was quite a high pressure session, Seth. So I take my hat off to you. But I also think there is a real need to like make it fun. And I think Emma at Nestle tells a great story about how she took the board to one of their farms and she planted some pants in the soil. And over time, she planted in different areas of the soil, some which were healthier soil versus not. And then they hung it up on a washing line and to demonstrate what good healthy soils looks like. And it started off with, you know, like heavily farmed, high fertilizer, all that jazz, with like a full knicker, a full pant, and then it goes down until it's literally like a skimpy thong because all the healthy like nutrients and bugs and stuff in the soil had eaten away. And I think that is like a really emotive, memorable piece that can also just help hammer home what you're trying to get on board. So I think alongside that business value, if you can make any like memorable stories, that's part of it. And we've spoken a lot about, you know, creating folklore and narratives. I think that's also a good area to lean on.
Early days in altruistic, and this will sound completely detached, but I'm going to bring it first full circle. Early days in our company, I used to think about minimum scalable personality, which is for myself, which is I had the opportunity to engage very densely with the first few people to join the company. But I thought actually like the person number 25, person number 30, person number 35, I'm not going to get the opportunity to build a one-to-one relationship with them. And so I have to think about things that scale and can transmit across many different people, you know, and like if you only engage me in a group Slack message or an all hands, you can still take away some element of who I am as a person, and that gives you a better idea of who we are as a company, etc. And so I would kind of think about, you know, mannerisms, things I say, you know, like appearances, like all these sorts of things as telling a story about me that can very quickly move at scale and at volume. And I think actually the same principle applies with training programs. The example that you've outlined from Emma is a great story that can transmit from one person to another to many, right? Like she told it to you, you've told it to me, we now have told it to our audience. It's very memorable, it's very catchy, and it gives a very simple message, which is soil is a natural thing, it's a living thing, and you know, it reacts in the way that living things do when presented with food, basically, right? And this, like, you know, this is a simple message that can transmit across a great distance. And that's perfect, I think, when you're trying to affect a company-wide change. You want many of those simple things because you're going to make this change across the whole company in very, very small increments, multiplied by 100,000 people, you know, in an organization like Nestle. At other times, you actually want great depth. And so maybe you actually want like have 8 procurement people in a room and you need high intensity, you know, training of like real deep content, frameworks, skill development, tests and quizzes and outcomes, you know, to be examined as well. And I think you need to mix and match both of those. You need some things that scale very well, very effectively, and you need some things that can just like have a really deep, very lasting change within a couple of days of practice and experimentation.
Seth, I love that. And I hope I hope we can scale Emma's knicker story en masse. But the last area that I want to talk about before we tune off is engagement levers and incentives. I know we're at time, Seth, so quick fire. If you had to choose 3 or 4, and I'm going to keep you to 3 and 4 this time, that doesn't mean 10. What would your like key engagement levers be? I mean, in terms of like the sustainability program, maybe if we could have an engagement lever for the board and then engagement levers for the company as a whole.
I think that like I would always look to work, I would kind of look at where you want to work sustainability engagement into existing levers or existing cadence versus where you want to drive something new. And so with the management team, the senior management team, I think again, bonuses and incentives are a great existing lever to drive action and change. And that's why I think they will be effective there. You need to do some things to make sure it's not gamed, with the best of intentions that it's not gamed. And we should talk about this at some point, and I think we have at some point previously. Um, but I think that's a great lever there. I think that with individual teams like procurement, marketing, sales, etc., I think that these teams are again usually very heavily incentivized by their actual business outcomes. And so what you probably want to take is you want to work in, whether it's an OKR or a KPI, you want to work it in quantifiably. Like in our organization, for example, if you look at our sales team is clearly focused on revenue attainment, right? Like that's the single goal maybe that our sales force is focused on. Maybe it shouldn't be that way, but like that's, like it or leave it, that's kind of what it is. And if we wanted to drive change in our sales team and how they operate, we'd say, okay, well, actually let's work in another goal, which is it always has to be a certain type of customer. And we will treat the sale differently if it's to a company that we actively want to be working with versus one that we're actually not so keen to work with for whatever reason. That if you work it into the existing cadence of operations, it will go much further. And then from the company-wide perspective, I actually think that brand is probably the best way to engage the company as a whole, which is if you start actually rethinking your company brand and what it stands for. Ultimately, like I think most people choosing a job these days are highly influenced by the brand that they're joining. They want to join a company that says something about them. This is certainly, I think, true for the highest in demand or the most in demand talent. They are, they have the liberty to choose from any number of places they could go and spend their time, and they will go to some place that says something meaningful about who they are as a person. And so I would really look at brand and how you think about that in a sustainability context as the best way to start driving engagement across the whole company, not just talent in the business, but talent that you want to join the business.
Yeah, I think that's a good breakdown. If I was just to add one more from my conversation with Kerry, is that they actually created a dashboard. So the regional leads, as I mentioned before, they all had a dashboard and they had a KPI in terms of like engagement metrics, and they were competing against each other region as to what their like rollout engagement metric was. So I think Christina managed to get 92% engagement, and their European counterpart, I think, was in the late 80s. But having that competition and gamifying it slightly at management level, I think can be really effective to make it trickle down into the kind of wider company. Also,
yeah, for sure. We're all competitive creatures, right? So yeah, I think for sure.
We are at heart. We're actually having a podcast in a few weeks with Camilla Ridderford on driving internal engagement, where we'll dig much. Camilla Ridderford also is head of sustainability at UK and Ireland at Arla. So we'll dive in a bit more into how she is doing it at Arla and draw on some of her case studies just to flavour this podcast even more. But Saif, any last thoughts?
No, I'm looking forward to the chat with Camilla. I think one of the interesting things with Arla is that it's I believe it's a cooperative as well, which means that there's an interesting quasi-competitive dynamic between suppliers, but they're also like, they have a big stake in the business. And so I think that's an interesting dynamic to manage as well. So I'm excited for that one.
Yeah, lots to come. Thank you, everybody, so much for listening. And look out for our next podcast coming out on next Thursday. Thanks.
Thanks, Izzy.